He shouldn't have felt watched in a place that had been empty for years. But the moment Officer Daniel Hayes stepped out of his truck and onto the cracked gravel path leading to the cave house, something in the air pressed back, quiet and heavy, like the land itself was holding its breath. The property sat just outside a forgotten stretch of northern Arizona, miles from the nearest town, where the wind carried dust across dry earth and whispered through jagged rock formations, and the house, if it could even be called that, was carved straight into the side of a limestone ridge, its entrance dark, uneven, and colder than the evening air should have allowed. Daniel adjusted his jacket, the fabric stiff from years of use, his badge catching a faint glint of the sinking sun, while beside him Rex stood still, unnaturally still, ears forward, amber eyes locked on the shadowed opening as if something inside had already noticed them first. Daniel exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man takes when he's trying to convince himself he made the right decision, even when every instinct says otherwise. For $100, that was all it took to buy this place. Less than what most people spent on a weekend getaway, and that alone should have been enough to walk away. But Daniel hadn't been thinking about value, not in the usual sense. He had been thinking about distance, about silence, about somewhere far enough from the past that it might finally stop following him. The real estate agent hadn't asked many questions, just slid the paperwork across the table with a look that lingered a second too long, like there was something she chose not to say, and Daniel hadn't pushed, because some silences feel safer when left untouched. Rex shifted slightly now, a low tension running through his body, not fear, not aggression, something sharper, something trained into him through years on the force. The kind of alertness that didn't come without reason. It's just a house, Daniel muttered under his breath, more for himself than the dog. But the words sounded thin against the vast stillness around them. The sun dipped lower, dragging long shadows across the ground, and the temperature dropped faster than expected, a chill seeping out from the cave entrance like it belonged to something deeper than rock. Daniel took a step forward, boots crunching against gravel, and Rex followed, though slower, reluctant in a way Daniel had never seen before. This was a dog who had walked into dark alleys, abandoned buildings, places filled with uncertainty, and never hesitated, not once. But here, something held him back, something invisible yet undeniable. As they reached the entrance, the smell hit first, damp stone mixed with something faintly metallic, not strong enough to place, just enough to linger at the edge of recognition. Daniel paused, scanning the interior where the light barely reached, revealing rough walls, uneven flooring, and a narrow corridor that bent out of sight. It wasn't large, not impressive, just a hollowed-out space that felt older than it should have been, like it had seen more than anyone had written down. Rex let out a low, controlled breath, almost a growl but not quite, the kind he reserved for moments when something didn't add up. Daniel crouched slightly, resting a hand on the dog's back, feeling the tension under his fur, steady and coiled. "Easy," he said quietly, though his own voice carried a hint of uncertainty he couldn't hide. The wind outside faded as if cut off by an unseen line, and for a moment, there was only silence, thick and absolute. Daniel straightened, stepped inside, and the temperature dropped another few degrees. Cool air wrapping around him like a warning he couldn't hear yet. Behind him, Rex hesitated for half a second longer, then followed, because that's what he always did, no matter what waited ahead. Neither of them knew it yet, but this place hadn't been empty at all. It had just been waiting. The deeper Daniel stepped into the cave, the more the outside world seemed to disappear, not gradually but all at once, like a door closing behind him without a sound, and the last trace of sunlight faded into a dull gray that barely touched the uneven stone walls. His boots echoed softly against the ground, each step measured, controlled, the habit of a man trained to notice what others ignored. Yet here, the silence felt different, not empty, but occupied by something that refused to show itself. Rex stayed close at his side, but not in the relaxed, confident stride Daniel knew so well. Instead, the dog moved with slow precision, nose low, ears flicking at sounds too faint for human hearing. His body angled slightly forward, as if pulled by something invisible. The air carried a faint chill that clung to Daniel's skin, cooler than it should have been for a structure carved into solid rock, and beneath that, there was a scent he could not quite name. Something old, something sealed away for too long. He reached for the small flashlight clipped to his belt and switched it on, the beam cutting through the dimness and revealing more of the interior, a narrow passage stretching ahead, its walls marked by uneven grooves that looked almost deliberate, not natural erosion, but something shaped by human hands. Someone spent time here, Daniel murmured, his voice low, steady, though it did not carry. Far in the dense stillness, Rex stopped suddenly, paws planted firm against the ground, his muscles tightening beneath his coat as a quiet rumble built in his chest, not loud enough to echo, but enough to send a clear signal. Daniel followed the dog's gaze to the right side of the passage where the wall seemed slightly different, smoother in texture, the stone surface broken by faint lines that did not match the rest of the cave. He stepped closer, raising the flashlight, and the beam revealed something subtle but undeniable, scratches, shallow but intentional, layered over one another as if someone had tried to mark the stone again and again. Daniel reached out, running his fingers across the surface, feeling the uneven grooves beneath his skin, and for a moment, a memory flickered in the back of his mind, not clear enough to form, just a sense of familiarity that made his chest tighten. Rex moved closer, pressing his nose near the wall, inhaling deeply, then pulling back with a sharper breath, his ears snapping forward as if he had just confirmed something only he could understand. "What is it, boy?" Daniel asked quietly, though he already knew the answer would not come in words. The dog shifted his weight and pawed lightly at the base of the wall. Once, then again, more insistently, the motion controlled but urgent. Daniel frowned, lowering the flashlight to the ground level where dust and fine debris had settled in a thin layer, undisturbed except for Rex's palm marks, and there, barely visible, was a line, straight, unnatural, cutting across the stone floor in a way that did not belong to the rest of the cave. His pulse slowed, not from calm, but from focus, the kind that took over when something began to make sense in the worst possible way. He crouched down, brushing away the dust with his hand, revealing more of the line, a narrow seam that extended along the base of the wall, too precise to be natural, too hidden to be accidental. Rex let out a low breath, then pressed his paw firmly against the spot, holding it there as if marking it, refusing to move. Daniel stared at it for a long second, the weight of realization settling in, not fully formed but heavy enough to feel. This was not just a cave, and whatever had been here before had not wanted to be found. The air seemed colder now, or maybe it was something else entirely, something that settled into the silence between each heartbeat. Daniel shifted his grip on the flashlight, stood slowly, and took a step back, eyes still locked on the wall, while Rex remained exactly where he was, unmoving, unwavering, as if guarding a truth that had been buried just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment and the right pair of eyes to uncover it. Daniel did not move for several seconds, his eyes fixed on the narrow seam carved into the base of the wall, the kind of detail most people would overlook, but once seen, it refused to be ignored. The silence around them deepened, pressing in from every side, until even the faint sound of Rex's breathing felt amplified, steady and controlled, a reminder that the dog was not uncertain, not guessing, but certain in a way that only instinct could justify. Daniel lowered himself slowly to one knee, brushing away more of the fine dust with careful movements, revealing that the seam extended farther than he first thought, running nearly 4 feet along the base before curving slightly upward, following a shape that did not belong to natural stone. He leaned closer, angling the flashlight, and the beam caught on something faint but distinct, a slight discoloration along the edge, like the stone had been handled more often than the surrounding surface. "This is not just a wall," he whispered, more to himself than to Rex, and the words felt heavier once spoken, like they carried a truth he had not fully accepted yet. Rex shifted again, pressing his nose closer to the seam, inhaling slowly, then stepping back half a pace, his body lowering slightly, as if bracing for something unseen. Daniel reached out, fingers tracing the curve of the line, and when he pressed lightly against one section, he felt it, a subtle give. Not much, just enough to confirm what his instincts had already begun to suspect. He pulled his hand back, heart beating slower but stronger now, the rhythm of focus replacing the earlier unease. "All right," he murmured, exhaling through his nose as he adjusted his stance, placing both hands against the stone where the seam curved upward. The surface felt cold, colder than the rest of the cave, and for a moment he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of recognition, the sense that once this line was crossed, whatever waited beyond it would not be simple, would not be something he could walk away from easily. Rex let out a low, steady breath, then took one deliberate step forward, positioning himself just to the side of Daniel, eyes locked on the wall, unwavering. Daniel nodded slightly, as if the dog had given permission, and applied pressure, pushing forward with controlled force. At first, nothing happened, the stone holding firm as though it had been sealed for years. But then, slowly, almost reluctantly, a faint shift occurred, a dull grinding sound that echoed softly through the narrow passage, not loud, but enough to break the stillness that had settled over the space. Daniel paused, listening, waiting, but nothing else followed. No sudden movement, no change in the air beyond the sound itself. He pushed again, this time with more confidence, and the section of wall gave way further, revealing a narrow opening just wide enough for a person to pass through if they turned sideways. A breath of colder air slipped through the gap, carrying with it a stronger trace of that metallic scent, sharper now, more defined, yet still not overwhelming, just enough to make his instincts tighten. Daniel stepped back, lowering his hands, and angled the flashlight into the opening, the beam stretching into darkness that seemed deeper than the rest of the cave, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. The passage beyond was not natural, that much was clear, the edges too straight, the floor too even, as if someone had carved it with purpose, not for shelter, but for something else entirely. Rex moved forward without hesitation now, stopping just at the threshold, his body still, ears forward, every part of him focused on what lay ahead. Daniel watched him for a moment, studying the way the dog held himself, not fearful, not aggressive, but alert in the purest sense, ready, as if this was exactly what he had been trying to show from the beginning. Daniel took a slow breath, then another, steadying himself, and stepped toward the opening, the beam of his flashlight cutting a narrow path into the darkness beyond, knowing that whatever waited inside had been hidden for a reason, and that reason was about to come into the light. Daniel stepped through the narrow opening with measured control, turning his shoulders slightly to pass between the stone edges, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the air changed in a way that was impossible to ignore, colder, denser, carrying a stillness that felt untouched by time. Behind him, the faint light from the main cave barely reached inside, and the beam of his flashlight became the only anchor in a space that seemed to absorb everything else. Rex followed without hesitation, now his paws making soft, deliberate contact with the ground, each step quiet but purposeful, his presence steady at Daniel's side. The passage extended forward for several yards before widening into a chamber that was clearly shaped by human effort, not nature. The walls smoother here, the angles sharper, as if someone had carved this place with intention rather than necessity. Daniel slowed as the beam of light revealed more detail, the floor even, compacted, not covered in the same loose dust as the outer cave, suggesting movement, repeated movement, over a long period of time. He crouched slightly, running the light across the ground, and there they were, faint impressions, not fresh, not clear, but enough to suggest that someone had walked this path before, more than once. Long before the entrance had been sealed, Rex moved ahead, by a step, then stopped, his head tilting slightly as if listening to something deeper within the silence, something beyond the reach of human perception. Daniel followed his gaze and slowly raised the flashlight, revealing the far side of the chamber where a small arrangement of objects sat against the wall, not scattered, not abandoned, but placed, carefully, deliberately. A simple wooden chair, worn but intact, faced the center of the room, its surface smooth from use, and beside it, a narrow table carved from rough planks held a few items that time had not fully claimed. Daniel approached cautiously, each step echoing faintly, his attention narrowing to the details that began to emerge in the light. On the table rested a metal canteen, its surface dulled but still recognizable, Next to it a folded piece of cloth, faded, its color nearly lost, and a small, rectangular object that caught the edge of the beam and reflected it back with a faint glint. Daniel reached out slowly, his fingers hovering for a moment before he picked it up, feeling the weight of it settle into his palm. It was a badge, not new, not polished, but unmistakable. The shape, the engraving, worn but still legible enough to carry meaning. His breath caught slightly, not from fear, but from recognition that came too quickly, too sharply to ignore. Rex stepped closer, his nose brushing near Daniel's hand, then lifting toward the air as if confirming what the object already suggested. Daniel turned the badge slightly, angling it toward the light, and the faint outline of a name became visible, not clear enough yet to read fully, but enough to send a quiet tension through his chest. This was not random, not forgotten, not something left behind without purpose. The arrangement of the room, the condition of the items, the hidden entrance, all of it pointed to something intentional, something planned. Daniel lowered the badge slowly, his mind beginning to connect pieces he did not yet fully understand, and for a moment, the weight of the place settled over him in a way that felt personal, as if the cave itself was no longer just a location, but a story waiting to be uncovered. Rex let out a soft, controlled breath and stepped toward the far wall again, his attention shifting, guiding, as if the badge was only the beginning, not the answer. Daniel followed, his grip tightening slightly around the object in his hand, knowing now that whatever had been hidden here was not just a secret, but something that had once belonged to someone who mattered, someone whose story had not ended the way it should have. And as the beam of light moved across the stone once more, the silence no longer felt empty, it felt patient, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Daniel stood still for a long moment, the badge resting in his hand, its worn edges pressing faintly into his palm, as if grounding him in something real, while his thoughts began to drift somewhere deeper. The cave no longer felt like a structure he had purchased, it felt like a place that had been waiting, not abandoned but paused, holding on to fragments of a life that had once existed within these walls. He turned the badge again, angling it closer to the beam of light, and this time the engraving caught just enough reflection to reveal more than before, letters emerging slowly from the worn metal, uneven but unmistakable. Rex stayed close, his presence steady, watching Daniel rather than the room now, as if sensing the shift not in the space, but in the man himself. Daniel inhaled slowly, then read the name under his breath, quiet, almost hesitant, as though speaking it too loudly might disturb something fragile that had been buried here. The name was not unfamiliar, not distant, but connected, tied to something he had tried not to revisit for a long time. His jaw tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition that came with weight, the kind that settled into the chest and did not leave easily. He lowered the badge for a moment, eyes scanning the rest of the table again, seeing it differently now, not as scattered objects, but as pieces of a story that had stopped mid-sentence. The folded cloth, the canteen, the chair positioned toward the center of the room, all of it suggested time spent here, waiting, thinking, enduring something that could not be seen but could be felt in the quiet arrangement of everything left behind. Rex moved again, stepping past the table and toward the far corner of the chamber where the wall curved slightly inward, his nose tracing along the stone with focused precision. Daniel followed, slower now, his thoughts catching up with him in fragments, memories that had no clear shape yet, only impressions that refused to stay buried. When he reached the corner, Rex paused and lowered his head, pressing his nose near the ground where the stone met a narrow ledge carved into the base of the wall. Daniel crouched again, bringing the light down, and there, tucked into the shallow recess, was something small, almost hidden, something that could have easily been missed if not for Rex's insistence. It was a notebook, thin, worn, its edges softened by time. The cover faded but still intact enough to suggest it had been protected from the worst of the elements. Daniel hesitated for a second before reaching out, his fingers brushing against the surface, feeling the texture of it, the dryness, the stillness of something that had not been touched in years. He picked it up carefully, holding it with both hands as if it carried more than just paper and ink. Rex lifted his head, watching closely, his ears forward, his body still, as though whatever was inside that notebook mattered more than anything else in the room. Daniel opened it slowly, the pages shifting with a faint sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the quiet chamber, and the first page revealed handwriting, uneven in places, but deliberate, each line written with intention. He leaned closer, bringing the light down, reading silently at first, his eyes moving across the words, and with each line, his expression changed, not dramatically, but enough to show that what he was seeing was not random, not disconnected. It was personal. The air seemed to press in closer around him, not threatening, but heavy with meaning, and Rex let out a soft breath, settling beside him, as if understanding that this was no longer about the space, but about the truth that had been left behind for someone to find. Daniel turned another page, then another, the sound of paper against paper echoing faintly, and the deeper he read, the more the past began to take shape in front of him, not as a distant story, but as something that had been waiting, quietly, patiently, for someone who would not ignore it. Daniel did not realize how long he had been kneeling there until his legs began to stiffen beneath him, but he did not move, his eyes fixed on the pages as if they might vanish the moment he looked away. The handwriting grew steadier as he read deeper, the early entries cautious, almost guarded, but later ones carried a weight that could not be hidden, each line pressed into the paper with quiet urgency. As though the writer knew time was limited, Rex remained beside him, calm now, no longer searching, no longer alert to the room, but anchored to Daniel, as if his task had shifted from finding the truth to standing witness as it unfolded. Daniel turned another page, the beam of the flashlight trembling slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the recognition that was beginning to settle into something undeniable. The name on the badge, the tone of the writing, the details scattered between the lines. All of it began to connect, not in a sudden revelation, but in a slow, tightening realization that pulled everything closer together. The writer had not come here by accident, had not simply wandered into the cave and stayed. This place had been chosen, hidden, prepared, and the entries spoke of waiting, of watching, of something that could not be explained openly but was clearly understood by the one who wrote it. Daniel exhaled slowly, his breath catching for a moment as he reached a page where the handwriting changed again, more uneven now, not frantic, but heavier, as if each word carried more than just thought, as if it carried memory. There were references to a case, not described directly, but hinted at in fragments, mentions of names that had been crossed out, places that had been shortened or obscured, and a repeated line that appeared more than once, written in slightly different ways, but always carrying the same meaning. Not everything was reported. Daniel read quietly, the words settling into the silence around him like a truth that had been waiting too long. His jaw tightened, the memory surfacing now with more clarity, a case that had been closed too quickly, filed away with answers that never fully made sense. He had been there, not at the center, but close enough to remember the unease, the questions that had never been answered, the feeling that something had been left unresolved. Rex shifted slightly, pressing his side against Daniel's knee, grounding him again in the present, in the moment where the past was no longer distant but unfolding right in front of him. Daniel turned another page, slower this time, bracing himself for what might come next, and the words that followed did not shout or accuse. They simply existed, written plainly, as if the writer had accepted something that could not be changed but still needed to be recorded. There was a final entry near the back, shorter than the others, written with a steadiness that felt different from the rest, not urgent, not uncertain, but resolved. Daniel leaned closer, reading it carefully, each word settling deeper than the last. It spoke of trust misplaced, of silence chosen over truth, of a decision made that could not be undone, and a reason why the writer had come here, why this place had been hidden, why the entrance had been sealed, not to disappear, not to escape, but to leave something behind, something that could not be altered or erased once it was found. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, the weight of it pressing against him, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and when he opened them again, he looked down at the notebook with a different understanding. This was not just a record, it was a message, not meant for everyone, but meant for someone who would recognize it. someone who would understand what had been left unsaid. Rex lifted his head slightly, watching him, waiting, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady, as if acknowledging something that had been forming since the moment they stepped into the cave. "You knew someone would come back for this," he said under his breath, not expecting an answer, but feeling as though one had already been given in the silence around him. The cave no longer felt like a mystery, not in the same way. It felt like a place that had fulfilled its purpose, revealing what it had held onto for years, and now leaving the next step to the one who had found it. Daniel remained still for a long moment after closing the notebook, his hands resting lightly on its worn cover, as if it might shift or disappear if he loosened his grip, and the silence around him no longer felt like something empty, but something that had spoken, quietly, without force, leaving him with a truth that did not demand reaction, only understanding. Rex leaned slightly closer, his presence steady and grounded, the warmth of his body cutting through the cold air that still lingered in the chamber, and Daniel let out a slow breath, longer than the others, as if releasing something he had been holding onto for longer than he realized. The badge still sat in his other hand, the metal catching faint light from the flashlight as he shifted his grip, and now, with the words from the notebook echoing in his mind, the name engraved there carried a weight that was no longer distant or abstract. It was connected, directly, undeniably, to the case he had tried to move past, the one that never quite sat right, the one that had been closed with answers that felt too clean, too convenient. Daniel rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate, controlled, but heavier now, as if each motion carried more meaning than before, and he looked around the chamber again, not as an investigator searching for clues, but as someone trying to understand a story that had been told without ever being spoken aloud. The chair, the table, the careful placement of each item, none of it felt random anymore. It felt intentional, like someone had prepared this space not just to stay hidden, but to leave something behind that would only make sense to the right person. Rex stepped forward again, his attention shifting back to the far wall, but this time his posture was calmer, less urgent, as if the search was no longer about finding something new, but about confirming what had already been discovered. Daniel followed, his gaze moving across the stone, slower now, more observant, and as the beam of the flashlight traced along the surface, something subtle came into view, not carved deeply, not meant to stand out, but there nonetheless, a set of markings etched lightly into the rock, lines that formed letters, faint but readable if you knew where to look. He stepped closer, angling the light, and the words revealed themselves gradually, not dramatic, not elaborate, just a simple line carved with steady hands. The truth was always here. Daniel felt his chest tighten, slightly, not from shock, but from the quiet certainty that settled over him, the kind that did not need explanation. He reached out, brushing his fingers lightly over the engraving, feeling the shallow grooves beneath his skin, and for a moment, the weight of everything aligned, the badge, the notebook, the hidden entrance, all of it leading to this single point where the past and present met without conflict, without noise. Rex let out a soft breath, almost like a sigh, and sat down beside him, his eyes lifting to meet Daniel's for a brief second, calm, steady, as if to say that what needed to be found had been found. Daniel nodded slightly, not consciously, but instinctively, acknowledging the moment in a way that did not require words. He stepped back, lowering the flashlight just enough to let the shadows return to the edges of the chamber, and in that dimness, the space felt different now, not as something hidden or concealed, but as something complete. The tension that had followed him into the cave had shifted into something quieter, something more grounded, as if the unanswered questions that once lingered had finally found a place to rest. Daniel glanced down at Rex, his expression softer now, less guarded, and for the first time since stepping onto the property, there was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke. "You knew," he said quietly, and the dog remained still, ears relaxed, gaze steady, not needing to respond because the answer had already been given in everything he had done. Daniel looked back at the chamber one last time, committing it to memory, not as a mystery, but as a truth that had waited long enough. And as he turned toward the narrow passage that led back out, the air felt lighter, not because anything had changed, but because something had finally been understood. Daniel stepped back through the narrow passage with slow, deliberate movements, the notebook secured in one hand and the badge held carefully in the other, as if both objects carried a weight far beyond their size. And behind him, the hidden chamber faded into darkness once more, not erased, but complete, its purpose fulfilled. Rex followed closely, his pace calm now, no longer searching, no longer driven by urgency, but steady in a way that mirrored Daniel's own shifting state of mind. When they emerged into the outer cave, the difference in air was immediate, warmer, lighter, though the faint scent of stone and dust still lingered, grounding the moment in reality. Daniel paused just inside the main chamber, turning slightly to look back toward the concealed opening, now barely visible again, the seam blending into the wall as if it had never been disturbed. For a brief moment, he considered sealing it once more, pushing the stone back into place and leaving everything exactly as it had been found, untouched, hidden, but the thought passed quickly, replaced by something steadier, something clearer. Some things were not meant to remain buried, not when they had been left behind with intention, not when they had been waiting for someone to understand them. Rex moved ahead a few steps, then stopped near the entrance of the cave, his silhouette outlined faintly by the dim light spilling in from outside. And when Daniel approached, the dog glanced back once, a simple, quiet check, as if confirming that they were leaving together. Daniel gave a slight nod, his expression calm but resolved, and together they stepped out into the open air where the evening sky stretched wide above them, the last light of day fading into soft shades of blue and gray. The wind greeted them again, carrying the familiar scent of dry earth and distant brush, and for the first time since arriving, Daniel felt it fully, not as background noise, but as something real, something present. He walked a few yards away from the cave entrance, then stopped, turning back to look at it. From the outside, the rough stone face blending into the landscape, unremarkable to anyone who did not know what lay within. The badge felt heavier in his hand now, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented, a connection that had been overlooked, a story that had been left unfinished. He slipped it carefully into his jacket pocket, close to his chest, while the notebook remained in his grip, its worn cover a quiet reminder that the truth was no longer hidden. Rex sat beside him, his posture relaxed, his gaze forward, watching the horizon as if the work was done, as if whatever had called him here had been answered. Daniel exhaled slowly, the tension that had once followed him replaced by something quieter, something steadier. And though the answers he had found did not erase the past, they gave it shape, gave it clarity in a way that silence never could. He turned toward his truck, each step measured but lighter than before, and as he opened the door, he paused. For just a second, looking back once more at the cave, not with suspicion, not with doubt, but with acknowledgement. It was no longer a mystery, no longer a question waiting to be asked. It was a truth that had found its way into the open, carried not by chance, but by loyalty, by instinct, by a bond that did not need explanation. Rex jumped into the passenger seat with quiet ease, settling in without hesitation, and Daniel followed, placing the notebook carefully on the center console before starting the engine. The headlights cut across the landscape as the truck turned onto the dirt path, the cave fading into the distance behind them, not forgotten, but no longer holding what it once had. And as the road stretched out ahead, Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting lightly near the notebook, knowing that what came next would not be about uncovering something hidden, but about bringing it into the light where it had always belonged. The road stretched long and quiet beneath the truck's headlights, a narrow ribbon of pale dust cutting through the darkening Arizona landscape, and Daniel drove without turning on the radio, without reaching for anything that might fill the silence, because for once, the silence did not feel like something he needed to escape. It felt earned, like a space where everything he had just uncovered could settle into place without being forced into meaning too quickly. Rex sat steady in the passenger seat, his posture relaxed but alert in that quiet way he always carried. Eyes forward, ears shifting slightly with each change in the wind outside. His presence a constant that required no explanation. Daniel glanced at him once, just briefly, then returned his focus to the road, one hand resting near the notebook on the console, as if keeping it close mattered more than anything else. The pages inside had already begun to change something in him, not by giving him answers he could act on immediately, but by confirming what he had felt for a long time, that not every truth disappears when it is ignored, that some truths simply wait, patient and unyielding, until someone is willing to see them. The memory of the case returned again, clearer now, not as a collection of reports or official statements, but as a series of moments that never quite aligned, details that had been dismissed too easily, questions that had been set aside because they did not fit neatly into the version of events that had been accepted. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel slightly, not out of tension, but out of resolve, the kind that builds quietly rather than all at once. He did not need to rush, did not need to react without thought, because what he carried now was not just evidence, it was context, it was perspective, it was the missing piece that turned uncertainty into understanding. The badge in his pocket pressed faintly against his chest with each movement, a steady reminder that this was not just about a place or a discovery. It was about someone who had trusted that the truth would find its way back, even if it took years, even if it required someone else to finish what had been left behind. Rex shifted slightly, turning his head toward Daniel for a moment, his gaze calm, steady, as if acknowledging the weight of what they carried without needing to question it. Daniel gave a small nod, almost instinctive, and returned his eyes to the road ahead, where the faint glow of distant lights began to appear on the horizon, marking the edge of the town he had left earlier that day. As the truck moved closer, the world began to change again, the open silence of the desert giving way to familiar signs of life, streetlights, buildings, the distant hum of activity. But Daniel did not feel the same distance he had felt before, the same separation between himself and everything else. Something had shifted. Something had settled into place in a way that felt grounded rather than heavy. He slowed as he reached the outskirts, the tires rolling from dirt to pavement with a soft, steady transition, and for a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what came next, not in dramatic terms, not as a confrontation or a resolution that would come all at once, but as a series of steps, careful, deliberate, guided by what he now knew rather than what he once assumed. The notebook would be read again, more thoroughly, the details examined with the patience they deserved, the connections followed where they led, not forced into a conclusion, but allowed to reveal themselves naturally. Rex settled back into his seat as the truck came to a stop at a quiet intersection, the red light casting a soft glow through the windshield, and Daniel rested his hand lightly on the notebook again, his thumb brushing against its worn edge. He did not speak, did not need to, because some moments do not call for words, they call for presence, for understanding, for the quiet acknowledgement that something important has changed. The light turned green, and Daniel eased the truck forward, merging into the quiet rhythm of the town, carrying with him not just what had been found, but what it meant. And as the night settled fully around them, there was no urgency in his movements, no rush to reach an end, only a steady sense of direction, guided by something simple, something unwavering, something that had been there all along. Sometimes the truth does not come with noise or force. It does not demand attention or announce itself with certainty. Sometimes it waits in silence, held together by time and memory, until the right moment and the right heart is willing to listen, and when it finally does, it does not change everything at once. It simply makes everything clear enough to move forward, one step at a time.